So the copy of Pavand here is taken from a cheap Type 1 audio cassette that I encoded with DBX, for the episode. This is the DBX noise reduction episode. Now, normally when I do those kind of specialized versions of Pavand, I try and deliberately jack them up just a little so it's at least a little obvious to viewers that this is not the normal digital file that I normally play. But this one turned out so well that I'm kind of convinced that a lot of people didn't realize that it was actually from a cassette. And that was the last test, I believe, I did with DBX, so I guess by then I'd had a little more experience. But it was also just one of those little decidedly personal touches as far as I was concerned, because, as I said, normally when I do the specialized Pavand, like with the reel-to-reel episode, it was intentionally too hot and it was distorting and stuff. In this case, the episode had been problematic enough that it just seemed right to have the best possible, version that I could put on there, whether or not anybody ever noticed it or not. Anyway, this commentary is going to go in a few different directions here. I know this is the DBX episode that I'm talking over here, but I'm going to go kind of into the whole, what I did this year, this season, was 100% showtune-free musical march. And I'm going to dip my toe into pretty much all the facets of it. So let me start at the beginning here. So in January, I was kicking around a thrift store and I found a standalone home mini disc recorder, and I picked it up, and it's one of those early archivisms. It was in one of the first episodes, and it was something that I had a bit of an axe to grind with initially, because my own experiences my own hopes had been dashed with it, because I had first used it in high school in a job I was working, and I loved that I could move around the track times and I could play with it. Granted, it wasn't intuitive in the slightest, but I liked the idea of being able to manipulate it after the fact. So when I got my own mini disc recorder a few years later and the thing was just a total piece of junk, it kind of set me off. And I guess I might have still been a little sour the first time I covered it on Archive. But anyway, so I had the mini disc idea going. I had that in the pipeline. And at the same time, I had bought a reel-to-reel deck because I wanted to be able to start expanding into open reel stuff, because I'd had a bunch of tapes lying around forever that I'd never been able to so much as figure out what was on them. And that was its own issue. And when I was going through trying to map out Archive episodes, map out a few in advance so I'd have some sort of direction, something to work for, I found that it was just going to work out that the month of March would have 3 slots for regular Archive episodes in it. And I figured, well, what the hell? I'm on an audio kick anyway. So I went and I rounded out the subjects with the DBX noise reduction system. Now, this is... I'm not entirely sure where to start with this. I guess we'll talk about another YouTuber for a hot second here, Techmoan. I know I have a bit of an overlap in viewer base with him, but this musical march thing wound up being a little unintentionally controversial, because I had absolutely no idea, for example, that he had been plotting his own mini disc episode, and then I put mine out and his showed up just, I think, 3 or 4 days later. And so there were a few cries of copycat and that sort of thing. But the only conscious bit of overlap in there in that whole month was with this episode, the DBX episode. And that was because I'd seen his episode on the records, the DBX records, and I was aware of DBX, and I thought it was a good subject and all, and I was just a little disappointed that he only went into the discs. So in my mind, it was just finishing up the topic and trying to give a little more complete picture of DBX. But so it wound up being, as I said, a bit controversial. There were a few cries of copycat, and I got a few more nasty comments than I normally do. Like with DBX, I had one person who was just furious at me, basically for the crime of disagreeing. So, as I say at the end of this episode, I'm just kind of indifferent towards DBX. It has its uses. It was probably a much better thing back then, but just as far as my own personal preferences go, it's just meh. I'm okay with it. I don't have any, trouble with it. It's just there, and it's just not really to my tastes. But, I guess that's the internet for you. Anyway, the whole 100% musical March thing, let's jump back to the beginning of that. So I had the mini disc recorder and the reel-to-reel, and I was trying to work on the reel-to-reel, and I wound up having to hire somebody to work on the reel-to-reel, and it's actually still a little bit in motion even now. But 6 months later, 5-6 months later, something like that. But it was just, as I mentioned, I had the 3 episodes mapped out for March, and that was just a little bit of serendipity. And it was all audio, so I just cheekily called it Musical March. And then on top of that, when you say Musical March, certainly in the internet sense, people think show tunes. They think actual musicals, Singing in the Rain and that sort of stuff. And that's just something I've never enjoyed. So it became consciously 100% show-tune-free. But on top of that, it was much more personal because I spent the first month and a half to 2 months of this year, 2017, on a temporary, if you will, one-off job, a very long one, that was a stage production of Beauty and the Beast, as in Disney's Beauty and the Beast, leading up to the release of the live-action movie version. And that was where I really just ran headfirst into my own dislike of show tunes. So that was meant as an especially personal thing. Again, I don't expect anyone to ever pick it out, but it was meant to be just that great exclamation point. 100% show-tune-free musical March. And it just this kind of goofy, fragmented concept, I guess you could say. And stuff. Oh, hey, serendipity. Good time for me to start discussing the problems I had making this episode. I'd still probably count the reel-to-reel episode to be the more problematic one, even if the problems didn't per se carry into the episode themselves, but it had just been such an issue for so long. I think I'm going to give that one the nod. But anyway, the DBX episode, as I discuss even in this segment, was very problematic. Even though I had started it back in, I think, late January or maybe just the very beginning of February, the unit I got that you're seeing some pics of the inside of right now, it just, it was beyond my abilities as far as fixing it up, and it was one of those things that was supposed to work when I got it. It was a Fleabay deal, yeah. And it just didn't happen. And what wound up happening was, well, for one, I wound up having to rush order a pretty pricey another DBX unit, which you'll see in a bit in this episode, just because I needed a working one to use. I had to get the episode done. I'd been messing around with the thing for like a month or something, and so it just had to get out the door. And so I had to rush order one, and it was just a big problem. And then prior to that, it was just this absolute nightmare trying to get DBX encoded records. I wanted at least a little bit of a cross-section of these things. And normally when I need specialized albums, I'll usually go on discogs.com, because you can look up specific pressings of things and order that. And 3 times in a row, I got the wrong the right album, but the wrong pressing. So the one that stands out to me, which wound up not happening in the episode, was one of the albums I wanted, and I wanted albums I was actually really familiar with. So the most familiar albums to me, just in my own listing that I found, were Teaser and the Firecat by Cat Stevens and Dreamboat Annie by Heart. My order for Dreamboat Annie just never happened at all. And the Cat Stevens one was not only not DBX encoded, it was just trashed. It was just like something even worse than I would pick out of a thrift store bin. So I had to throw that whole thing, concept completely out. But I just kept getting sent the wrong things. So I was trying to pick out albums, again, that I already knew. So the Joan Armatrading album, I ordered that one initially. It was supposed to be DBX, and it wasn't. And it was just this endless, maddening cycle. And the Loggins and Messina one, I actually got right on the first time, but the seller just was dragging his feet, and I think it took like 3 weeks for him to finally get off his butt and send it to me. So the records were just an absolute nightmare to deal with, and it wound up being an especially costly episode, not just because of the rush ordering and all the online stuff, but because I was getting a little worried and I needed to finish the episode. So I was just going and finding any old DBX albums I could get my hands on online. And the only one of those kind of peripheral ones that I wound up using was the Tchaikovsky Romeo and Juliet and Nutcracker excerpts that I finished this episode with. And that was because it was still sealed. So I wanted to be able to test it, real, as fresh as possible, supposedly DBX at its finest. And I half joke later in the episode that it skipped on the first play. And that is true. I got it. It was still sealed. It looked great. I didn't notice anything, but it still skipped on me the first time I tried to play it. And I used it for the stinger, the moment that it skipped. But I wound up having to take 2 passes at that album. Now, everything you hear in this episode from that record is from that initial pass. So there's no cheating involved there. But just to have a proper backup copy, I wound up afterwards taking another pass at it, and it played fine the second time. So I've got a 2 CD set kicking around of that one. But anyway, this was also one of those episodes, and this applies to 100% showtune-free musical march in general, that I was running headfirst into the limitations of YouTube's audio reproduction capabilities. So, with the mini disc episode, I didn't even bother. I mentioned early in this commentary that when I do like a specific audio format, if I can, I'll put Pavand onto that use it in that particular format in that particular way. But the mini disc one was just the usual file because there was no real difference between the my copy and what I got on the back end, although I was able to mangle a bad copy later on. And this is one of those episodes that, these audio episodes in general are always kind of a tough sell to do with YouTube because it's only good as what YouTube can reproduce. It's only as good as what you, the viewer, have in terms of speakers or whatever. And I guess when I make these episodes, I need to just start suggesting that people at least have headphones, because I keep running into the same comments over and over again. I don't hear any difference between A and B. Well, if you're watching on your iPad, you're probably not going to notice anything too different. So, yeah. Anyway, I guess I'm really pretty much out of things to say about this one, but I'll throw in a couple of stray thoughts here at the end. As I mentioned earlier, I was getting some comments from people that were upset at me for disagreeing and over personal taste, and sometimes just nitpicky, stupid things like the reel-to-reel tests. I don't know how many times in the span of the 2 episodes that I mentioned, or at least implied, that while I could go up to 15 inches per second, there is no bias setting for 15 IPS on that. But nonetheless, people, a few people felt the need to school me on my own ineptitude on that, because I'm clearly not aware that staring at the front of, say, the reel-to-reel, that you just kind of have to live with it with certain things. I mean, it's not a professional setup. A professional setup would be great, maybe someday, but yeah. Didn't really intend for this to be a bitch fest, but I guess it kind of came out that way. Anyway, that's really about all I have to say about this episode, so I think I'm gonna pull the plug here, and thanks for listening. Hopefully you learned a little something about the process, learned a little something about the creative process, all that great stuff. But I'll shut up now. Ben here from the archive. I'll see you later. Anyway, the one disc that I will not be excerpting, I just thought I'd show you real quick.